Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The island that time passed by. You stand at the bow of the research vessel as it cuts through the Pacific, somewhere between the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, watching the horizon shimmer in the tropical heat. The year is 2025, but the island you're approaching exists in a different temporal dimension altogether. Not literally, of course, though the scientific team aboard has made stranger hypotheses over the past 3 months of preparation. This island, officially designated as Takaroa in the naval charts from 1943, but unnamed on any map before that, has remained essentially unchanged for approximately 8,000 years. Your role as a cultural anthropologist specializing in isolated communities has taken you to remote places before. You've documented the last speakers of dying languages in the Amazon, lived among reindeer herders in Siberia for 18 months, and spent a full year on a research station in Antarctica. But nothing in your 15-year career has prepared you for what the satellite imagery suggests about Takaroa. The island shouldn't exist in its current state. The flora visible from orbital photography matches species that went extinct on neighboring islands over 4 millennia ago. Thermal imaging shows settlement patterns unchanged since at least the Bronze Age. Most remarkably, atmospheric analysis of the air column above the island reveals pollen signatures that haven't been detected anywhere else on Earth since the Holocene climatic optimum, roughly 6,000 years before present. The island first appeared in Western records when a Japanese reconnaissance plane photographed it in 1942 during a mapping mission. The pilot noted it in his log, but marked it as uninhabited and strategically worthless. American forces catalogued it a year later, but never landed, noting only possible native settlement, no apparent resources. After that, Takaroa vanished from official interest for 8 decades. No shipping lanes passed within 50 nautical miles. No commercial flights crossed its airspace. The island existed in a gap, a blind spot in the modern world's comprehensive surveillance. You only learned of Takaroa's existence 14 months ago, when a graduate student analyzing historical weather patterns noticed an anomaly. Satellite data from 1999 through 2023 showed virtually no change in the island's vegetation patterns. Not just slow change, but none whatsoever. Trees appeared in identical positions across 24 years of imaging. Coastal erosion, which should have been measurable, seemed absent. The student, thinking it was a data error, almost deleted the files. Instead, she mentioned it to her advisor, who mentioned it to a colleague, who eventually mentioned it to you. The vessel's engines changed pitch as you approached the outer reef. The captain, a weathered New Zealander named Morrison, who has spent 40 years navigating these waters, has never heard of anyone visiting Takaroa. My grandfather used to talk about an island out here, he told you 3 days ago, as you departed from Honiara. Called it something in his language, not Takaroa. He said his grandfather told him never to go there. Said time worked differently there, that people went in and didn't come out the same. You asked what he meant, but Morrison just shook his head. Just old stories, yeah, but I've sailed these waters since I was 16, and I've never once thought to go near it. Didn't even remember it existed until you showed me the coordinates. The island emerges from the morning haze like a fever dream. Steep volcanic peaks rise nearly 800 meters above sea level, their slopes covered in forest so dense and dark green it appears black from a distance. White beaches ring the coastline, and you can see what appears to be a lagoon on the western side, its waters an impossible shade of turquoise. Smoke rises from several points inland, suggesting human habitation. Everything about it looks pristine, untouched, exactly as an uninhabited Pacific island should look, except it's not uninhabited, and that's where the mystery deepens into something profound and unsettling. 3 other researchers stand beside you as the island grows larger. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geneticist from Berkeley, has brought equipment to collect DNA samples from any inhabitants, flora and fauna. Dr. James Okonkwo, a linguist who speaks 14 languages and has documented over 30 more, carries recording equipment and a burning curiosity about what language might have evolved in 8 millennia of isolation. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a botanist specializing in evolutionary biology, can barely contain her excitement at the possibility of studying plant species unchanged for thousands of years. "I still can't believe we got approval for this," Sarah says, not for the first time. The permit process took 11 months and required sign-off from 5 different governments, 3 international organizations, and a dozen academic institutions. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization wanted to declare the island a World Heritage Site unseen. The Ethics Review Board nearly shut down the expedition entirely, arguing that contact with the inhabitants, if any existed, could be catastrophic. In the end, a compromise was reached. 1 visit, no more than 14 days, a team of no more than 10 people, absolutely no introduction of foreign materials, and a commitment to withdraw immediately if the inhabitants showed any sign of distress or disease. You are the 10th person. The other 5 are the ship's crew, who will maintain the vessel and provide support, but not go ashore unless absolutely necessary. Morrison will stay with the ship. The 9 of you who will land have spent the last 3 months in quarantine, being tested for every pathogen known to medical science, receiving no vaccines that might shed, and taking antibiotics to reduce your bacterial load. You've been instructed to touch as little as possible, to document everything, to take samples only of materials the inhabitants clearly discard, and to leave nothing behind. Each of you carries 2 weeks of food in your pack, though the plan is to resupply from the ship every 3 days. You wear clothing made from natural fibers that will decompose if somehow left behind. Your equipment has been selected for minimal impact. The island draws closer, and you begin to see details. The smoke comes from what appear to be cooking fires, at least a dozen visible from your vantage point. Structures dot the coastline, though at this distance you can't make out their nature. Something moves along the beach, too far away to identify, but clearly human. Your heart accelerates. After 14 months of preparation, after decades of academic work leading to this moment, you're about to make first contact with a people who may have had no outside interaction for 8,000 years. "There," James says, pointing to the northern beach. "That looks like a cleared area, maybe a landing site." Through binoculars, you can see what he means. A section of beach, perhaps 50 meters wide, where the jungle has been cut back, creating a clear demarcation between forest and sand. Whether it's maintained as a landing area or serves some other purpose, you can't tell, but it's your best option for bringing the inflatable boats ashore. Morrison calls down from the bridge. "Getting some weird readings on the instruments. Nothing dangerous, just odd. Magnetic variation is off by about 3 degrees from what the charts show, and the depth here doesn't match the surveys from 1943. Actually, the bottom seems to have risen by nearly 10 meters. That shouldn't be possible in 82 years. Not in a stable volcanic system. Sarah exchanges a glance with you. Adding it to the list of anomalies, she says dryly. The list has grown long over the months of preparation, the atmospheric composition, the vegetation stability. The thermal signatures suggest a human population of between 200 and 500 individuals, yet there is no visible agriculture on the scale necessary to support that many people. The complete absence of the island from any indigenous oral traditions collected from neighboring islands, despite those traditions preserving memories of events from over 1,000 years ago. The fact that every attempt to fly a drone over the island in the past year has resulted in equipment failure within 2 minutes of crossing the shoreline. We're not going to understand anything from out here, Yuki says. She's right, of course. You've analyzed the island from every remote sensing method available. You've studied the limited historical records, consulted with elders from every inhabited island within 500 kilometers, and built climate models and geological surveys and epidemiological projections. Now, you need to actually set foot on Takaroa and see what 8,000 years of isolation has created. The ship drops anchor 200 meters offshore, in water so clear you can see the coral formations on the bottom, 25 meters down. The inflatable boats are lowered and you make your final checks. Each person reviews the protocol one more time. Approach peacefully, hands visible, no sudden movements. Offer gifts of shells collected from other islands, as these can't introduce new pathogens. Attempt communication through gesture and expression. Observe and document. Above all, do no harm. You climb down into the first boat with James and Sarah. Yuki takes the second boat with 2 of the support crew, bringing the equipment too sensitive to risk in the first landing. Morrison watches from the deck, his expression troubled. 12 days, he says. If you're not back to the ship in 12 days, I'm obligated to report your position and request extraction. 14 days and I'd leave whether you're back or not. Those are the terms. 12 days, you confirm. We'll be back in 8. The outboard motor starts with a cough, and the boat begins moving towards shore. The water is so clear it feels like flying over the reef rather than floating on it. Tropical fish scatter beneath you, species you recognize from every Pacific island you've visited. At least the marine life seems normal. But as you approach the beach, you notice something odd about the sand itself. It's not the typical coral sand of Pacific islands, crushed white and pink fragments. This sand appears darker, almost grey, and has an unusual uniformity to it, as if it's been somehow processed or sorted. The boat's hull scrapes against the sand as you reach the shallows, and you step out into water up to your knees, warm as bath water. The beach slopes gently upward, and at the tree line you can see your first clear view of human construction. Several structures made from woven palm fronds and wooden poles, raised on platforms about half a meter off the ground. Traditional Pacific architecture, except the design doesn't quite match any specific culture you've studied. The rooflines are steeper than Polynesian, the platforms lower than Melanesian, and the weaving pattern unlike anything in your reference materials. And then you see them. 3 people emerge from the tree line. moving toward you with a casual, unhurried gait that suggests they've been expecting you. 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 30s, though age is difficult to judge. They wear minimal clothing, woven skirts, and nothing else, and carry no visible weapons. Their skin is a rich brown, their hair black and straight, and their features suggest an ancient Austronesian heritage, but with subtle differences you can't quite place. They're smiling. The woman raises her hand in a gesture that unmistakably means greeting or welcome in any culture. You raise your hand in return, and the 2 groups approach each other cautiously, stopping about 5 meters apart. You set down your pack slowly, removing the shell necklace you prepared as a gift. The woman steps forward, accepting it with what appears to be genuine pleasure, examining the shells closely. She says something in a language that sounds like nothing you've ever heard, musical and rhythmic, but with phonemes that don't quite match any language family, you know. James is already recording, his expression one of intense concentration. Not Austronesian, he murmurs. Or if it is, it's diverged so far that I can't even catch cognates. The rhythm is unusual, almost tonal, but not quite. Those sounds she's making, that clicking, that's not common in any Pacific language. The woman gestures toward the structures, clearly inviting you to follow. You look back at the boat, where Sarah nods encouragingly. The second boat has landed, and Yuki is already photographing the vegetation at the tree line, her excitement barely contained. You make a decision and gesture acceptance to the woman, shouldering your pack and following her up the beach. The structures are even more interesting up close. The weaving is incredibly tight and uniform, apparently waterproof. The wooden poles are lashed together with cordage made from plant fiber, but the lashing technique uses a pattern you don't recognize, creating joints that appear stronger than anything you've seen in traditional construction. Inside the nearest structure, you can see woven mats, several pottery vessels of a distinctive reddish clay, and what appear to be fishing nets hanging from the rafters. More people emerge from the forest, perhaps 20 in all, ranging from young children to elderly individuals. They don't crowd you, maintaining a respectful distance, but their expressions show clear curiosity. A few of the children point and whisper to each other. An elderly man, his hair completely white, approaches slowly, leaning on a walking stick carved with intricate patterns. The 3 who greeted you step aside deferentially. You understand you're now meeting someone of importance, probably a chief or elder. He speaks, and his voice is surprisingly strong for someone who must be at least 70. The language is the same musical rhythm you heard before, but his speech has a formal quality, clearly a greeting of some kind. James is recording everything, occasionally glancing at his waveform display and shaking his head in wonder. You bow slightly, a gesture of respect universal enough to be understood, and offer the second shell necklace you brought. The old man accepts it with a nod, then does something unexpected. He reaches into a pouch at his waist and removes a small carved object, offering it to you. You take it carefully, examining it in the sunlight. It's a whale tooth, carved with extraordinary detail into the shape of what appears to be a bird, possibly a frigate bird or albatross. The craftsmanship is museum quality, with every feather individually rendered. He says something else, gesturing at the carving, then at the sky, then at the ocean. I think, James says slowly, he's telling you a story. That gesture, The way he's sequencing the directions, it's narrative. He's saying something about the bird and the sea and the sky. You nod to the old man, hoping your expression conveys gratitude and understanding, even if you can't comprehend the words. He seems satisfied, turning and beckoning for you to follow him into the village proper, which you can now see extends back from the beach into a cleared area under the jungle canopy. The architecture continues in the same style, with structures raised on platforms, but as you move deeper, you see more complexity. There are areas clearly designated for specific purposes. A cooking area with multiple fire pits and ceramic vessels of various sizes. A work area where several people appear to be making tools or crafts, and what might be a communal meeting space marked by a circle of carved stones. Sarah is examining everything with the eye of a geneticist looking for clues about population dynamics and health. They look remarkably healthy, she whispers to you. No obvious signs of malnutrition, no visible infections or diseases. That woman there must be at least 60, and her teeth look better than mine. And I haven't seen any evidence of the genetic problems you'd expect from a small, isolated population. No obvious disabilities, no signs of inbreeding depression. It's true. Everyone you see appears vital and healthy, from the infants carried by their mothers to the elderly sitting in the shade of the structures. The children are energetic and curious. The adults move with easy strength, and even the oldest individuals seem alert and engaged. For a population that has supposedly been isolated for 8,000 years, with all the genetic bottlenecks and inbreeding that would imply, they look impossibly healthy. The old man leads you to the largest structure in the village, its platform slightly higher than the others, its roof peak adorned with carved wooden figures. Inside, the light filters through the woven walls in a soft, diffused glow. Mats cover the floor, and several people are already seated around the perimeter. The old man gestures for you to sit, and you do, your team arranging themselves beside you. The villagers sit across from you, perhaps 15 people in all, representing what you assume is the leadership or elder council of this community. What follows are the most fascinating and frustrating 3 hours of your professional life. The old man speaks at length, clearly explaining something important about the island, the people, and their history. Others occasionally interject, adding details or corrections. James records it all, his expression cycling between elation and despair as he tries to catch linguistic patterns. The language has a structure unlike anything he's encountered, with what appear to be verb forms that change based on temporal distance, suggesting a culture deeply concerned with the relationship between past, present, and future. They bring food, and you're faced with an ethical dilemma. The research protocol strictly forbids consuming anything from the island to prevent possible contamination in both directions. But refusing hospitality in any Pacific culture is a serious insult. You compromise by accepting small portions and eating only fruits that appear to be common varieties: banana, coconut, and breadfruit. The flavors are intense, almost overwhelming, as if these plants have been concentrating their essences for millennia without the genetic dilution of modern agriculture. As the sun begins to set, the old man makes a gesture that clearly means you should stay, that shelter will be provided. You consider the offer carefully. The protocol allows for camping on the island, but recommends maintaining some separation from the inhabitants. However, refusing this hospitality could damage the fragile relationship you're building. You accept, and the villagers seemed genuinely pleased, several of them immediately beginning to prepare one of the structures for your use. That night, lying on woven mats in a structure at the edge of the village, you and your team compare notes in whispered conversations. James has identified at least 40 distinct phonemes in the language, more than twice the number in English, including several sounds that don't appear in any known language family. Sarah has observed approximately 230 individuals, with an age distribution that suggests a stable population with regular births and relatively low mortality. Yuki has catalogued 17 plant species that should have gone extinct thousands of years ago, and found 3 that don't appear in any botanical database. Possible endemic species that have evolved in isolation. The question, Sarah says in the darkness, is how? How does a population this small maintain genetic diversity for 8,000 years? How do they avoid the diseases that devastated every other isolated population when contact was made? How do they look this healthy without modern medicine or visible agriculture extensive enough to support their numbers? And the language, James adds, language drift should be much more pronounced. 8,000 years is enough time for a language to become completely unrecognizable from its root. English and Sanskrit are separated by about 6,000 years, and they're barely related. This language should be unlike anything on Earth, and it is, but it's also internally consistent in ways that suggest it hasn't changed much. The elders' speech and the children's speech are essentially identical, which shouldn't be possible in a living language. Yuki's contribution is the most unsettling. Those trees at the edge of the village, I took core samples from 3 of them, and the growth rings are strange, not absent, which would suggest a completely uniform climate, but they're too regular. Trees respond to environmental stress, dry years and wet years, storms and droughts. These trees show almost no variation in their growth patterns over what appears to be hundreds of years. It's as if the weather here is essentially stable, year after year, decade after decade. You lie awake long after the others sleep, listening to the sounds of the village settling for the night, the gentle percussion of waves on the beach, and the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, someone is singing a melody so beautiful and strange it raises gooseflesh on your arms. The question that keeps circling your mind is not how this happened, but why. Why does this island exist in this state? What purpose does it serve? Or what accident of geography and history has created this anomaly? The whale-tooth carving rests in your hand, its surface smooth and warm. You examine it again by starlight filtering through the walls, and you notice something you missed earlier. The bird is depicted in flight, but beneath it, carved in miniature, are waves, and within the waves, even smaller, are what appear to be faces, dozens of them looking upward at the bird. Craftsmanship required to create something so detailed is extraordinary, but more than that, it suggests a symbolic or mythological significance. The bird, the water, and the faces must mean something in the culture of these people. Tomorrow you'll begin the systematic documentation process. You'll photograph every structure, every tool, and every artifact you can observe without being intrusive. Sarah will collect hair samples if permitted, environmental DNA from the soil and water, and anything that might provide genetic information without requiring blood or tissue from the living. James will record hours of speech, trying to build a basic lexicon and grammar. Yuki will expand her botanical survey, perhaps venturing inland with a guide if the villagers permit it. But tonight, you simply exist in this space, this island that time passed by, and feel the weight of 8,000 years of isolation pressing in around you. You drift into sleep finally, and you dream of birds flying over an endless ocean, of waves that never change, and of people speaking in rhythms that echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. When you wake to the sound of the village stirring at dawn, you feel as if you've slept for 1,000 years, and just for an instant, simultaneously. The second day begins with a gift that changes everything. One of the younger men, perhaps 25 years old, approaches your structure at first light. He carries a large woven basket filled with what appear to be rolled bark cloths, each one tied with a cord made from twisted plant fibre. He sets the basket down outside the structure and speaks a few words in his musical language before withdrawing respectfully. James, already awake and reviewing his recordings from the previous day, immediately reaches for the basket. "We should wait," you say. "Let's not appear too eager." These could be sacred objects or personal items. We need to understand the cultural context before we start examining them. But Yuki has no such hesitation. "They were given to us," she says, carefully removing one of the rolls and beginning to untie it. Refusing a gift would be more insulting than examining it. She has a point. As she unrolls the bark cloth, you see that it's covered in markings, intricate designs that could be decorative or could be some form of writing. The patterns are consistent across the visible surface, suggesting intentional communication rather than random decoration. James leans in, his excitement palpable. "That's not decoration," he breathes. "Look at the repetition, the way certain patterns appear in different contexts. This could be a writing system, an actual independent writing system that evolved in complete isolation." He pulls out his camera and begins photographing the cloth in detail, taking dozens of shots from various angles and lighting conditions. Sarah joins you in examining the basket. There are 7 rolled cloths in total, each one slightly different in size, but all covered in the same type of markings. "If this is writing," she says, "then we're looking at a level of cultural development that shouldn't be possible in a population this small." Writing systems typically emerge in large, complex societies with specialized roles and extensive trade. You need scribes, you need something worth recording, and you need institutional structures to preserve and transmit the knowledge. Unless, you say, the idea forming as you speak, unless they've had 8,000 years to develop these things, 8,000 years of uninterrupted cultural evolution. No conquests, no pandemics, no dark ages, just steady, continuous development. The implications are staggering. The oldest known writing systems on Earth, Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics, are only about 5,000 years old. If these people developed writing independently, they had an extra 3,000 years to refine and elaborate it. What could a writing system look like after 8 millennia of evolution? You emerge from the structure to find the young man who brought the basket waiting nearby, sitting patiently on the log. When he sees you, he stands and gestures for you to follow him. You exchange glances with your team and gather your equipment and follow him into the village. He leads you past the communal areas to a structure slightly apart from the others, distinguished by carved posts at each corner depicting what appear to be historical or mythological scenes. Inside, the light is dim, but as your eyes adjust, you see something that stops you in your tracks. The walls are covered, floor to ceiling, in more bark cloth, all of it inscribed with the same intricate markings. There are hundreds of sheets, perhaps thousands, arranged in what appears to be a specific order. This is an archive, a library, a record of 8,000 years of history, preserved in a medium that should have degraded long ago, but somehow hasn't. The old man from yesterday is here, along with two other elderly individuals, a man and a woman. They're sitting on low stools, and in front of them is a collection of objects, carved wooden tablets, stone tools, and pottery shards, all arranged in what appears to be chronological order. The old man gestures for you to sit, and when you do, he begins to speak, pointing to each object in turn. "He's telling us their history," James whispers, his voice shaking with the magnitude of what's happening. This is an oral history backed by physical artifacts and written records. This is how history is supposed to be preserved, how it was preserved before we developed archaeology. For the next 6 hours, the old man and his companions take you through the history of their people. You don't understand the words, but the combination of artifacts, gestures, and the written records they occasionally reference makes the broad narrative clear. They show you stone tools that must be thousands of years old, pottery that evolves in style and complexity through the ages, and wooden carvings that demonstrate increasing sophistication in technique and subject matter. Sarah is filming everything, her camera capturing not just the artifacts, but also the way the elders handle them, the reverence with which they unroll each piece of bark cloth, and the specific gestures they make when referring to particular periods or events. Yuki is photographing the physical objects, creating a visual database that will take years to properly analyze. James is recording every word, building what will become the foundation of a linguistic analysis unprecedented in anthropological research. And you're trying to see the pattern, the through line of their history. From what you can piece together, these people arrived on the island in what must have been the late Neolithic period, probably around 6000 BC. They came in boats, deliberately, and they never left. The artifacts show no evidence of outside contact after that initial arrival. No introduced materials or technologies, nothing but what they could develop or make from the island's resources. But they didn't stagnate. Progression of their material culture is clear, improving pottery techniques, developing more efficient fishing methods, and creating increasingly sophisticated tools and artworks. And at some point, perhaps 3,000 years after their arrival, they developed writing. The early examples, which the elders show you with obvious pride, are simple pictographs, representational drawings that convey basic information. But over time, the system evolved into something far more complex, with abstract symbols that represent not just objects but concepts, relationships, and temporal states. The old man pauses in his narrative to unroll a particularly large bark cloth, this one covered in what appears to be a single continuous text rather than separate entries or records. He traces his finger along the markings, speaking in a rhythmic, almost ritualistic tone. The woman beside him watches intently, occasionally nodding or adding brief comments. "I think this is their creation story," James says. The rhythm of his speech has changed. It's more formal, more structured, and look at how the other elders are responding. This is sacred text, their mythology. The old man continues for nearly an hour, his finger moving across the bark cloth in patterns that you gradually realize follow a specific reading direction, top to bottom, right to left, spiraling inward toward a central image. When he finishes, he carefully rolls the cloth and places it back in its position on the wall, and turns to you with an expression that seems to ask, "Do you understand?" You bow deeply, hoping to convey your respect and appreciation, even if comprehension remains elusive. The old man smiles and nods, then stands, gesturing toward the entrance. The formal presentation appears to be over. As you emerge back into the daylight, blinking in the tropical sun, you feel fundamentally changed. You came to this island expecting to document an isolated culture, perhaps to find linguistic or genetic curiosities. Instead, you've discovered a civilization with recorded history going back millennia, with cultural continuity unbroken by the catastrophes and dark ages that marked every other human society on Earth. The afternoon is spent in a different kind of education. The young man who brought you the basket, whose name sounds like Kaimana when he introduces himself through gesture and repetition, takes you on a tour of the island's productive areas. You walk through groves of breadfruit trees, their trunks marked with carved symbols that you now recognize as their writing system. Each marking, Kaimana explains through gesture, indicates who tends that particular tree, when it was planted, and what familial or social obligations are associated with its fruit. The agricultural system is unlike anything you've encountered. There are no large cleared fields, no monocultures, and no apparent irrigation systems. Instead, the forest itself has been shaped over millennia into a productive landscape. Food-bearing trees are scattered throughout, their spacing optimal for both growth and harvest. Understory plants include taro, yams, and other staples, each one positioned where it will thrive. Nitrogen-fixing plants are integrated throughout, maintaining soil fertility without any need for fertilizer. This is a food forest system, Yuki says, using a term from permaculture that describes exactly what you're seeing. But it's been refined over thousands of years. Every plant has a purpose. Every position is intentional. This isn't just agriculture, it's ecosystem engineering at a level that modern permaculture is only beginning to understand. Kaimana leads you to a freshwater spring that emerges from the volcanic rock about halfway up the island's slope. The water is cold and perfectly clear, pooling in a natural basin before flowing down toward the village in a carefully maintained channel. Around the spring, carved stones have been arranged in patterns similar to the writing you saw in the archive structure, clearly marking this as a significant or sacred site. He makes an offering, placing a small carved piece of wood beside the spring and speaking a few words in his musical language. Then he invites you to drink, cupping water in his hands and demonstrating. You follow suit, and the water is possibly the best you've ever tasted, slightly mineralized but pure and cold. Sarah takes a sample in one of the sterile containers she brought, noting the location and conditions for later analysis. As the sun begins to descend, casting long shadows through the forest, Kaimana takes you to one final location, a promontory on the northern point of the island that offers views across the ocean in all directions. Here you can see the full extent of the reef system, the way it encircles the island in a protective embrace. Beyond the reef, the Pacific stretches to the horizon in every direction, empty and endless. Kaimana points to the ocean and says a word, repeating it several times to make sure you understand. James records it, analysing the phonemes. I think it means beyond or outside, or maybe otherworld. He says, the way he's using it, it seems to carry connotations of both distance and difference, as if the world beyond the reef is fundamentally distinct from the world of the island. It makes sense, you think, for a people who have lived here for 8,000 years, who have no memory of anywhere else. The island is the world. Everything beyond is abstraction, story, and myth. The ocean is not a highway connecting this place to others. It's a barrier, a boundary, the edge of reality. You wonder what their creation mythology says about the origin of their people. Did they arrive from beyond, or were they always here? Do they remember boats and navigation, or has that knowledge been lost to time, replaced by myths of emergence from the island itself? That night, the village holds what appears to be a celebration in your honor. Fires are lit in the communal area, and food is prepared in quantities far exceeding the daily norm. As darkness falls, people gather around the fires, and music begins. The instruments are simple, percussion from hollowed logs and shells, wind instruments made from bamboo, and stringed instruments whose frames are shaped like elongated figure eights. But the music itself is complex, with interwoven rhythms and melodies that create patterns of sound unlike anything in your experience. Then the dancing starts. It's not the hula you've seen in Hawaii, or the war dances of New Zealand. This is something entirely their own, movements that seem to tell stories through gesture and form. Men and women dance together and separately, sometimes in large groups, sometimes in pairs, and sometimes in solo performances that hold the entire village's attention. The firelight catches on their skin, on the shells and feathers they've adorned themselves with, and on the expressions of joy and concentration on their faces. Kaimana approaches you, extending his hand in clear invitation to join the dance. You hesitate, aware of your clumsiness and your lack of understanding of the forms and meanings. But he insists, gently, and you allow yourself to be drawn into the circle of dancers. The rhythm is infectious, and you find yourself moving with it, if not gracefully, then at least enthusiastically. The villagers seem delighted by your participation, offering encouragement and gentle corrections to your movements. Sarah is dancing with several of the village women, laughing as they teach her the steps. James has been pulled into a circle of younger men, attempting to mimic their movements with mixed success. Even Yuki, normally reserved and serious, is swaying to the rhythm at the edge of the firelight, a genuine smile on her face. For a few hours, the scientific mission recedes, and you're simply people sharing a moment of human connection across the vast gulf of cultural isolation. Later, much later, when the fires have burned down to coals and most of the village has retired to their structures, you sit with the old man and a few other elders, sharing the comfortable silence of exhaustion. One of the elders, a woman with silver hair and eyes that seem to see through you, reaches out and touches your arm gently. She speaks a few words, her tone serious, almost urgent. James, still awake and alert despite the late hour, leans in to listen. "I'm not sure," he says, "but I think she's warning us about something. That word she keeps using, I've heard it before in other contexts, and it seems to mean change or transformation or maybe ending." She's pointing at us, then at the ocean, then at the village. I think she's saying that our presence here represents change, that things cannot remain as they have been. The old man nods slowly, adding his own words to the woman's. His tone is not angry or afraid, but it carries weight and significance. He gestures at the sky, at the ocean, at the island itself, and you understand that he's talking about time, about the long, unbroken span of their history, and how it may be coming to an end. We knew this, Sarah says quietly. We knew that contact would change everything. That's why the Ethics Review Board almost stopped the expedition. We're the end of their isolation, whether we want to be or not. You feel the responsibility of that truth settle heavily on your shoulders. These people have maintained an unbroken cultural continuity for 8 millennia, have preserved knowledge and traditions across hundreds of generations, and have created something unique and irreplaceable. And your presence here, no matter how careful you are, no matter how respectful your documentation, represents the beginning of the end of that isolation. The old man seems to sense your distress. He reaches out and places his hand over yours, speaking gently. You don't understand the words, but the meaning is clear enough. What will happen, will happen. There is no blame, no resentment, only acceptance of change as an inevitable force. After 8,000 years, they understand impermanence better than any culture on Earth. That night, you don't sleep well. You keep thinking about the warning, but the responsibility you carry. The protocol specifies 14 days maximum on the island, but now you're wondering if you should cut that short, limit the exposure, and minimize the change you're inevitably bringing. But you also know that the documentation you're gathering is invaluable, perhaps the most important anthropological discovery in history. Every additional day provides more data, more understanding, and more preservation of knowledge that may soon be transformed by contact with the wider world. In the morning, the decision is made for you. Morrison's voice crackles over the satellite phone, urgent and concerned. You need to come back to the ship. There's a weather system developing to the east, a big one. The forecasts are showing a possible cyclone forming within the next 48 to 72 hours. If it tracks this direction, we need to be well clear of the island before it hits. You gather your team and explain the situation. The villagers notice your preparation to leave, and word spreads quickly. Within an hour, the old man and several others have assembled, bringing with them more gifts. Bark cloths covered in writing, carved wooden objects, woven textiles, and samples of their crafts and technologies. They're giving you their knowledge, their history, entrusting it to you to preserve and protect. The farewell is emotional. Kaimana, who has been your guide and companion for 2 days, embraces you in the traditional way of his people, touching foreheads and breathing together. The old man places both hands on your shoulders and speaks at length, his words clearly a blessing or prayer. The silver-haired woman who warned you about change is crying openly, though whether from sadness or joy or some more complex emotion, you cannot tell. As you load the boats with your equipment and the precious gifts you've been given, you turn back one last time to see the entire village gathered on the beach. They're not waving or calling out, just standing together, watching you leave with the same patient, accepting expression the old man showed last night. They understand that this moment marks the end of something, the beginning of something else, and the transformation of their world in ways they cannot fully anticipate but do not resist. The journey back to the ship takes only minutes, but it feels like crossing a temporal gulf. You're moving from 8000 BC to 2025, from a world where time moved at the pace of seasons and generations to one where it races by in seconds and nanoseconds. As you climb aboard and Morrison immediately begins preparations to depart ahead of the approaching storm, you watch the island recede into the distance, smoke still rising from the cooking fires, the forest still dark and deep and unchanged. "We got samples," Sarah says, organizing her collection of environmental DNA and hair samples. "Enough for extensive genetic analysis. I think we'll find something extraordinary here. Some explanation for how they've maintained such genetic health despite the isolation." "And I have hundreds of hours of recordings," James adds. "It'll take years to analyze properly, but we have the foundation of a grammar and lexicon. We can begin translation work on the bark cloths they gave us and start to understand their written history. The botanical samples alone represent possibly 5 new species and confirm sightings of at least a dozen thought to be extinct," Yuki says. "The ecological implications are enormous. This island is a refuge, a biological time capsule." You nod, acknowledging their observations, but your mind is elsewhere. You're thinking about the old man's hands on your shoulders, the weight of blessing and responsibility. You're thinking about what happens next, after the initial publications and the inevitable media frenzy, and the debates about whether to maintain the island's isolation or integrate its people into the modern world. You're thinking about the fact that you may have just witnessed the last days of a truly independent human culture, the last gasp of a way of life that existed outside the global civilization. The storm that Morrison warned about arrives that night, but you're 50 nautical miles away by then, safe in deeper water. You watch from the ship's deck as lightning illuminates the clouds to the west, where the island lies hidden. The storm rages for 18 hours, with wind and rain of cyclonic force, and you wonder how the village fares. Their structures are built for such weather, refined over thousands of years to withstand the worst the Pacific can offer, but still you worry. When the storm finally clears, Morrison cautiously approaches the island again to verify its condition before your final departure from the region. You're relieved to see smoke rising from the cooking fires, boats drawn up on the beach, and life continuing as it has for 8 millennia. "They're fine," Morrison says. "Probably barely noticed the storm. This island has been here through thousands of cyclones. They know how to ride them out." But as you sail away for the final time, you carry with you the knowledge that bigger storms are coming, metaphorical ones that no amount of traditional knowledge can prepare them for. The moment your report is filed, the moment the first images and recordings are made public, the island will become a destination, a curiosity, a prize to be studied and protected and inevitably changed. The isolation that allowed them to develop so uniquely will end, not with conquest or disease as it did for so many indigenous peoples, but with the quiet, relentless pressure of global civilization. The report takes you 4 months to write. Every sentence feels inadequate to the task of describing what you witnessed, every analysis incomplete in the face of the island's profound mysteries. Sarah's genetic results arrive in increments, each one more surprising than the last. The population shows remarkable genetic diversity for its size, suggesting either a much larger founding population than would seem possible or some mechanism of maintaining variation that geneticists don't currently understand. Disease resistance markers are present for pathogens they should never have encountered, as if their immune systems have been primed by exposure to a wider range of challenges than their isolation would suggest. Telomere lengths in the DNA samples suggest average lifespans significantly longer than comparable populations, possibly explaining the prevalence of healthy elderly individuals you observed. James makes the first breakthrough in translating the bark cloths in week 7. The writing system is partially logographic, with symbols representing whole words or concepts, and partially syllabic, with characters indicating sounds. It evolved, he determines, from a mixed ancestry. The founding population apparently included people from at least 3 different linguistic groups, and their writing system synthesized elements from multiple traditions before crystallizing into its current form. The text itself, when he begins to decode it, contains exactly what the old man suggested: their history, going back to what they call the arrival, a deliberate voyage to the island by a group fleeing some unspecified catastrophe or conflict on their original home islands. They knew what they were doing, James tells you over a video call, his excitement barely contained. The arrival wasn't an accident or a storm-driven mishap. It was planned. They brought seeds, tools, knowledge, and everything they needed to establish a permanent settlement. And here's the really interesting part. They deliberately isolated themselves. The texts refer to cutting the cord, a metaphor for severing ties with the outside world. They didn't want contact. This was intentional isolationism from day one. Yuki's botanical analysis confirms that the island's ecosystem is both ancient and managed. Several of the plant species are indeed endemic, having evolved in isolation over thousands of years, but they've been shaped by human selection and cultivation into forms optimized for food production, medicine, or materials. The food forest system you observed represents the endpoint of 8,000 years of agricultural refinement, a closed-loop system that maintains fertility and productivity without external inputs. It's the perfect sustainable agriculture, she writes in her section of the report. If we could understand and replicate this system, it could transform how we approach food production globally. Your own contribution to the report focuses on the cultural and anthropological implications. You describe the social structure as far as you could observe it. Apparently egalitarian, but with a council of elders holding authority on matters of tradition and history. You detail the material culture, the architecture, and the arts and crafts that demonstrate both continuity with ancient Pacific traditions and unique innovations developed in isolation. You discuss the psychological and social adaptations necessary for such a small population to maintain stability across so many generations, and the mechanisms that would prevent destructive conflicts, or the kind of cultural stagnation that destroyed other isolated groups. But the heart of your analysis deals with the question of why. Why did these people choose isolation? The texts James has translated provide some answers. They left their original homes during a period of conflict and upheaval, possibly the same Bronze Age collapse that devastated civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East around 1200 BC. They sought a refuge, a place where they could preserve their way of life, free from the violence and chaos of the wider world. And they succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation in maintaining that refuge for 8 millennia. The report is submitted to the consortium of institutions that funded the expedition in month 5. By month 6, it is leaked to the media, and the story explodes into global consciousness. The island that time forgot, the headlines proclaim, though you wince at the cliché. 8,000-year isolation ends. Lost civilization discovered in Pacific, and the last unknown people on Earth. The coverage is intense and largely irresponsible, filled with speculation and exaggeration. Some outlets suggest the islanders possess advanced knowledge or technologies. Others hint at genetic differences that make them superior to modern humans. The conspiracy theories begin almost immediately. The island is protected by ancient aliens. The people are time travelers, and they've discovered immortality. You do your best to counter the misinformation, giving interviews and writing op-eds emphasizing the truth. These are ordinary humans who happen to maintain cultural continuity and isolation longer than any other known population. They're not superhuman or magical. They're simply the product of 8,000 years of unbroken cultural evolution in a stable environment. But nuance doesn't sell newspapers or generate clicks, and the sensationalism continues unabated. By month 7, 3 different governments have claimed jurisdiction over the island. Papua New Guinea asserts that it falls within their exclusive economic zone. The Solomon Islands argues that traditional navigation routes and historical connections give them priority. A third nation, unnamed in the news reports, but clearly acting through proxies, has filed a claim with the United Nations based on archaeological evidence of ancient migrations from their region. The legal battle becomes complex and bitter, with each side accusing the other of neo-colonial ambitions or cultural imperialism. The island's people, you think bitterly, have no say in any of this. They're the subject of the debate, but not participants in it. Their wishes, assuming anyone bothered to ask them, are unknown and apparently irrelevant to the nations and organizations fighting over the right to protect or study or develop their home. The isolation they maintained for 8,000 years is being stripped away not by their choice, but by the inexorable machinery of global politics and academic competition. In month 8, you receive an encrypted message through a secure channel. It's from Morrison, the ship's captain, and the content is disturbing. Thought you should know, he writes. There are boats near the island, research vessels officially, but some of them aren't flying any flags I recognize. Whatever happens next, it's already started. The island isn't isolated anymore. You try to verify his information, but the satellite imagery of the island is suddenly restricted, classified by some authority with enough power to block civilian access. The governments claiming jurisdiction have apparently agreed on at least one thing: controlling information flow about the island. Official statements speak of protecting the indigenous population from exploitation and preventing unauthorized contact, but the effect is a blackout. No independent researchers can access the island, no journalists can visit, and even the original members of your expedition are prohibited from returning. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization announces in month 9 that the island will be declared a World Heritage Site and placed under international protection. A multinational research team will be established with participation from all interested nations to conduct systematic study while minimizing impact on the indigenous population. Contact will be limited and carefully controlled. The people of the island will be consulted on all decisions affecting their home and their culture. It sounds reasonable in the press releases, but you know how these things work. The multinational team will spend years arguing about protocols and priorities. The consultation with the islanders will be mediated through translators and cultural brokers, their voices filtered through layers of interpretation. The protection will gradually morph into management, and management into control, and before long the island will be a museum. Its people exhibits in a living display of ancient culture, their autonomy sacrificed to the global imperative to preserve and study and understand. You receive a package in month 10, delivered by courier with no return address. Inside is a piece of bark cloth covered in the now familiar writing of the island, along with a brief note in English. From the old man. He asks me to give this to you if I could. K. You recognize Kaimana's initial, though how he learned to write in English or managed to leave the island and send this package, you cannot guess. Perhaps one of the boats Morrison saw. Perhaps some arrangement with sympathetic researchers or activists. Perhaps the islanders' isolation has already eroded more than anyone publicly admits. You take the bark cloth to James, who has become the world's primary expert in the island's language. He studies it for 3 days before calling you to his office at the university. It's a message, he says, is specifically for you. The old man knew what was coming. He saw it in your faces, in the way you looked at the village, at them. He wrote this as a warning and a request. The translation takes another week, working through layers of meaning and cultural context. The message, when James finally provides it in written English, is both simple and profound. To the visitor who came with respect, we knew the time of change was coming. Our histories speak of it, cycles of isolation and contact, withdrawal and emergence. We chose isolation 8,000 years ago because the world beyond was chaos. We chose to preserve rather than expand, to maintain rather than conquer, but we always knew the ocean would not protect us forever. Now, the time of isolation ends and we face the chaos once more. Our request is simple. Remember us as we were, not as we will become. The people who come after, who will be changed by contact with your world, will still be us, but also different. Do not judge them for becoming different. Do not mourn the loss of our isolation as if it makes us less. Change is not death. It is transformation. Tell our story, but tell it truly. We were not frozen in time. We chose our path. We maintained our culture, and we preserved our knowledge. We were never lost. You did not discover us. We allowed ourselves to be found. Remember that when the scholars and politicians argue over what to do with us, what we need and what we should become, we are not objects to be studied or protected. We are people who made a choice 8,000 years ago and who now make a different choice. Honor that choice. Honor our agency in our own story. The message continues for several more paragraphs, providing specific requests. They want their bark cloth archives copied and preserved in multiple locations so that no single disaster can destroy their recorded history. They want researchers to be allowed to study their language and culture, but they want to participate in that research as partners, not subjects. They want the opportunity to learn about the outside world, to make informed decisions about their own future, and to integrate or not as they choose, rather than having integration forced upon them, or isolation maintained for the convenience of researchers and governments. It's a declaration of independence, James says. After 8,000 years of isolation, they're asserting their right to self-determination in the modern world. It's remarkable, and it's going to be ignored by everyone making decisions about their future. He's probably right, but you have to try. You take the translated message and begin sending it to every relevant authority. The United Nations Committee overseeing the World Heritage designation, the governments claiming jurisdiction, the research consortium being formed, and the media outlets still covering the story. Most ignore it. Some publish excerpts without comment. A few anthropologists and ethicists pick it up and write supporting pieces, arguing that the islanders' wishes should be paramount in any decision about their future. In month 12, exactly 1 year after you first stepped onto the beach of the island that time passed by, you receive an invitation to testify before the United Nations Committee. They want your first-hand account, your expert opinion on the cultural and psychological state of the islanders, and your recommendations for how to proceed. You accept, of course, though you're skeptical that your testimony will make any difference. These things are usually decided in advance, with public hearings serving as mere formalities to provide a veneer of due process. The testimony takes place in Geneva on a cold February morning, in a conference room with windows overlooking the lake. The committee consists of representatives from 15 nations, plus observers from various international organizations and indigenous rights groups. You're one of several expert witnesses called to testify, alongside Sarah, James, and Yuki, as well as anthropologists who have studied other isolated populations and legal scholars specializing in indigenous rights and international law. You speak for 30 minutes, describing your time on the island, the people you met, and the culture you observed. You emphasize their agency, their choices, and their sophisticated understanding of their own history and situation. You read portions of the old man's message, translated by James and verified by 2 other linguists, who have since learned enough of the language to check his work. You argue forcefully that any decision about the island's future must prioritize the wishes of its inhabitants. The committee members listen politely, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions. When you finish, they thank you for your testimony and call the next witness. You sit in the gallery and watch the rest of the proceedings, increasingly frustrated by the way the conversation keeps drifting away from the islanders' agency and toward abstract debates about preservation versus integration, traditional culture versus modernization, and isolation versus contact. In month 13, the committee issues its decision. The island will be designated a World Heritage Site with the highest level of protection. A permanent research station will be established on a neighbouring uninhabited island, allowing ongoing study without direct intrusion on the main island. Contact with the islanders will be limited to quarterly visits by a small, rotating team of researchers, all of whom must complete extensive training in cultural sensitivity and language basics. The islanders will be offered, but not required to accept, various forms of assistance, medical care, educational opportunities, and communication technology. Most importantly, the decision affirms that the islanders retain sovereignty over their island and their culture, with the right to refuse any intervention or contact they do not wish to accept. It's not perfect, but it's better than you dared hope. The affirmation of sovereignty is crucial, even if its practical enforcement remains uncertain. The quarterly visit restriction will limit the impact of contact, while still allowing ongoing relationship building and cultural exchange. The research station on a neighbouring island is a compromise that satisfies the scientific community's desire for access, while protecting the islanders' daily life from intrusion. You learn later, through informal channels, that the old man's message made a difference. Several committee members cited it in private deliberations, using it to argue against more intrusive proposals. The indigenous rights observers, in particular, seized on the message as evidence that the islanders were capable of sophisticated engagement with their own situation and should be trusted to make their own decisions. In month 15, you're invited to join the first quarterly visit to the island under the new protocols. You accept, both eager to see how the islanders are faring and anxious about what changes might have occurred in your absence. The team is small: yourself, James, Sarah, and 2 new researchers, a medical anthropologist and a specialist in Pacific Island cultures. The approaching boat carries not just people, but also gifts requested by the islanders during previous contacts, paper and writing implements, certain medicines they've asked for, and seeds of crops that don't grow on the island, but that they're curious to try cultivating. The beach is familiar and strange at once. The physical landscape is unchanged. The same dark sand and towering trees, the same structures visible at the tree line. But there's a new building, larger than the traditional structures, with a corrugated metal roof that glints in the sun. Solar panels have been installed on several buildings, gifts from one of the governments, claiming to support the islanders' welfare. A satellite dish points skyward from the highest point in the village. Kaimana meets you on the beach, and you're struck by how much he's changed. He's wearing a t-shirt now, though he's kept the traditional woven skirt. He greets you in a heavily accented but comprehensible English. "Welcome back. The old man wants to see you." The village is busier than you remember, but the fundamental patterns remain unchanged. The communal cooking area still serves as the social hub. Children still play in the same spaces, though now some of them are playing with a soccer ball alongside their traditional games. The archive structure is still carefully maintained, but it's been expanded, with new bark cloths being added to document this period of change and contact. The old man has aged visibly in the 15 months since you last saw him. His hair is thinner, his movements slower, but his eyes are as sharp as ever. He greets you with the traditional touching of foreheads, then speaks at length. Kaimana translates, his English improving as he goes. He says thank you for speaking for us. He says the message was received and it made a difference. He says we are changing, as we knew we would, but we are choosing how we change. That is the important thing. Not that we stay the same, but that we choose our path. The old man invites you to sit, and over the next hour, he describes what has happened in your absence. The solar panels provide electricity for lighting and for charging devices. Several islanders have been learning to use computers, primarily to communicate with researchers and to access information about the outside world. They've started a project to digitize their bark cloth archives, creating permanent backups of their recorded history. 3 young adults have expressed interest in leaving the island temporarily to study at universities, wanting to understand the modern world more fully before deciding whether to integrate or maintain isolation. But we are not leaving forever, Kaimana adds. We want to learn and then come back to bring knowledge here. We want to understand your world while keeping our own. The medical anthropologist on your team, Dr. Patel, has been invited to examine any islanders who wish to be seen. Several do, mostly elderly individuals with chronic conditions that could be alleviated with modern medicine. But the consultation is careful and consensual. Dr. Patel explains each treatment option and the risks and benefits, and allows the individuals to choose. The old man declines all treatment, saying he has lived long enough and prefers to end his days in the traditional way. Over the next 3 days, you witness the delicate balance the islanders are maintaining between tradition and change. The morning routine remains unchanged, waking with the sun, communal breakfast, and the day's work assigned through consultation among the elders. But in the evenings, some of the younger islanders gather around a laptop, watching videos of the outside world, asking questions, and trying to understand the civilization that exists beyond their reef. Are all the cities that big? A young woman asks, watching footage of Tokyo. Where do they grow their food? How do they decide who leads? A young man wants to know, watching a news report about elections. Do the elders choose, or does everyone speak? Kaimana has become the bridge, a translator not just of language, but of concepts. He explains democracy and markets and technology, translating between worldviews as much as between words. It's a role he's taken on with seriousness and grace, understanding that his people's future may depend on how well he can help them understand the world they're cautiously opening themselves to. On the final day of your visit, the old man calls a gathering of the entire village. It's evening, and fires are lit in the communal area, as they were for the celebration during your first visit. But this is a different kind of gathering. The old man speaks for a long time, his words translated in segments by Kaimana. He's talking about change and continuity, about the choices their ancestors made 8,000 years ago, and the choices the current generation must make now. Our ancestors chose isolation to preserve our way of life. They chose to cut the cord, to sail beyond the reach of chaos and conflict. For 8,000 years, their choice protected us. We maintained our culture, our language, and our history. We became something unique in the world, but isolation was always a means, not an end. The goal was preservation, and preservation does not mean stasis. A living culture must change, or it dies. So we now choose a different kind of preservation. We will maintain what is essential, our values, our knowledge, and our connection to this land. But we will also learn from the outside world, take what is useful, understand what is dangerous, and make informed choices about our future. The speech continues, laying out principles for how the community will handle contact and change. All major decisions will be made collectively, with extensive consultation. No one will be forced to adopt new ways or forced to maintain old ones. Young people who wish to experience the outside world will be supported but also taught their own culture, so they can return with both knowledge bases. The archive will continue to grow, documenting this era of change as meticulously as previous generations documented their time. When the old man finishes, other elders speak, then younger members of the community. A vigorous debate ensues, entirely in their own language, about specific policies and decisions. Should they accept more medical technology? Should they allow more researchers to visit? Should they establish formal diplomatic relations with the nations claiming to protect them? The debate is democratic and passionate, with everyone who wishes to speak being heard. You realize you're witnessing something extraordinary, a culture deciding its own fate, not having it decided for them by outside authorities. The United Nations' decision to affirm their sovereignty has given them the space to have this debate, to make these choices, and to chart their own course between isolation and integration. As you prepare to leave the next morning, the old man takes you aside one final time. Through Kaimana, he says, "You will write more about us. Others will study us. We will become known to your world. That is inevitable. But remember always, we are not artifacts. We are not museum pieces. We are living people making choices, the same as people everywhere. Our choices may be different because our history is different, but they are no less valid. Tell that to those who study us. Tell that to those who seek to protect us. We do not need protection. We need respect. You promise to carry that message, and you mean it. The old man nods, satisfied, and places his hand on your shoulder in blessing one final time. As the boat carries you back toward the research station, and then toward the wider world, you look back at the island, smoke rising from its cooking fires, children playing on its beaches, and its people going about their lives with the same patient, deliberate care they've shown for 8,000 years. The quarterly visits continue over the next 3 years. Each time you return, you see more changes, more solar panels, more interaction with outside technology, and more young people learning English and other languages. But the core remains stable. The archive continues to grow. The traditional structures are still maintained alongside the new buildings. The communal decision-making process still governs major choices. The island is changing, but it's changing in ways the islanders choose at a pace they control. In year 4 after the initial contact, the first 3 islanders who requested it traveled to the outside world. 2 young men and 1 young woman, all in their early 20s, leave for universities in New Zealand and Australia. They'll study various subjects: biology, anthropology, and engineering. The agreement is that they'll return for at least 3 months every year, maintaining their connection to the island while building knowledge and skills to bring back. Their departure is marked with ceremony. The entire village gathers on the beach, and the 3 travelers are blessed by the elders, given woven tokens to carry as reminders of home, and instructed in their responsibilities to learn and return and teach. It's emotional but not tragic. The islanders understand that this is expansion, not abandonment. Their world is growing larger, but it's not dissolving. You're there for that departure, having arranged your schedule to witness this historic moment. As the boat carrying the 3 young islanders moves away from the shore, you stand beside Kaimana, who has chosen to remain on the island despite having the same opportunity to leave. Why stay? You ask him. You could study anywhere, learn anything. He considers the question seriously before answering. I am learning here, he says, learning to be a bridge, to translate between old and new, between our way and the outside way. That is the work I am meant for. The others will learn outside things and bring them here. I will learn to understand both worlds and help my people navigate between them. That is equally important. He's right, of course. The success of the island's careful integration depends on having people who can mediate, and who understand both the deep traditions of their culture and the complexities of the modern world. Kaimana has positioned himself as exactly that bridge, and he's young enough to serve in that role for decades. The old man dies in year 5, peacefully in his sleep, having reached what Dr. Patel estimates was roughly 95 years old, an impressive age for someone who spent their entire life without modern medicine. The funeral ceremonies last for 3 days, involving the entire island community in complex rituals of mourning, celebration, and transition. The new generation of elders, who have been learning from him for the past 5 years, take up the responsibilities of preserving and transmitting the culture's knowledge and wisdom. His death marks the end of the direct living connection to the period before contact. Everyone now alive on the island has a memory of the outside world's existence, and has made choices about how to engage with it. The era of pure isolation is definitively over, but what replaces it is not dissolution or assimilation. The island maintains its distinctiveness, its cultural practices, and its language, even as it selectively adopts elements from the outside world that its people find useful or interesting. By year 7, a pattern has stabilized. Approximately 10% of each generation now spends time in the outside world, studying or working or simply experiencing different ways of life, before most return to the island. Some don't return immediately, but they maintain connections, send back information and resources, and plan an eventual homecoming. The population remains stable at around 250 individuals, with births roughly matching deaths. The genetic health that so puzzled Sarah in the initial studies continues, suggesting that whatever mechanisms maintain diversity during isolation are still functioning, even with the addition of new genetic material from the few outsiders who marry into the community. The island story becomes a case study in managed contact, cited in Indigenous rights conferences and anthropological journals as an example of how isolated populations can engage with modernity without being destroyed by it. The key, researchers agree, was the islanders' agency in the process, their ability to make choices about the pace and nature of change, rather than having change forced upon them. You continue to visit quarterly, watching children grow into adults, seeing the village evolve in small increments. The Barkcloth archive now includes sections on the time of opening, the period of first contact and subsequent integration. Future generations will read these accounts and understand how their ancestors navigated this transition, what they chose to keep and what they chose to adopt, and why they made the decisions they made. On your 20th visit, in year 6 after first contact, Kaimana shows you something remarkable. The young people of the island, those who have travelled outside and those who have stayed, have collaboratively created a document they call the Principles of Continuity and Change. It's written in both their traditional script and in English, and it lays out a philosophical and practical framework for how the community will continue to navigate the relationship between tradition and modernity. The principles include commitments to maintain the language as the primary medium of communication on the island, to preserve the traditional decision-making structures while adapting them to new challenges, to teach every child both the old ways and enough of the outside world to make informed choices about their own lives, to continue the archive as a living document of their culture, to welcome outside knowledge while remaining critical consumers of it, and to always prioritize the well-being of the community over individual advancement. It's our declaration, Kaimana explains, not of independence, because we never lost that, but of intent. This is what we choose to be going forward, not frozen in the past, not rushing to become like the outside world, but something in between. Ourselves, but evolving. The document is formally adopted by the community in a ceremony that blends traditional elements with new ones. It's carved into stone tablets to ensure its permanence, recorded on bark cloth in the traditional way, and also digitized and backed up in multiple locations around the world. It becomes the island's unofficial constitution, the framework that will guide future generations in making choices about their culture and their relationship with the wider world. Your own work shifts over these years. The initial publications about the island made your career, establishing you as the world's primary expert on this unique culture, but you've become more than a researcher. You've become an advocate, a translator, a bridge like Kaimana, but operating in the other direction. You interpret the island to the outside world, push back against exploitation or romanticization, and argue for policies that respect the islanders' autonomy. You write a book in year 8 after first contact. It's titled The Island That Time Passed By, 8,000 Years of Isolation and 1 Generation of Change. It becomes a bestseller, not because it's sensationalized, but because the true story is extraordinary enough without embellishment. You tell the story honestly. The discovery, the first contact, the challenges of integration, and the islanders' thoughtful and deliberate approach to modernity. You include extensive translations of the bark cloth archives, giving readers direct access to the islanders' own accounts of their history and their perspective on contact and change. The book's final chapter is titled Lessons from the Island, and in it you reflect on what the wider world can learn from this unique case. The importance of agency and cultural change. The possibility of selective adoption of technology and ideas without wholesale cultural transformation. The value of maintaining continuity with the past while remaining open to the future. The necessity of giving communities the space and power to make their own decisions about their own futures. The island that time passed by, you write in the conclusion, was never actually passed by time. It existed in time, changed through time, and evolved over time, the same as any human culture. What it was passed by was the particular trajectory of development that the rest of the world followed, the cycles of empire and collapse, the Industrial Revolution, and the digital age. It followed a different path, not slower or faster, not better or worse, just different. And now that path has intersected with the global mainstream. What happens next is not predetermined. The islanders are not doomed to assimilation or defossilization. They are simply people making choices, and those choices will create their future, a future that honors their past without being imprisoned by it. The book is translated into 17 languages and sparks conversations around the world about cultural preservation, Indigenous rights, and the nature of progress. You give lectures at universities, consult with governments and organizations working with isolated or Indigenous populations, and become a voice for the principle that cultures have the right to self-determination. But you always return to the island every 3 months, because that's where the real story continues to unfold. In year 10 after first contact, you witness the marriage of one of the young people who left to study and an outsider she met at university. The outsider, a man from Thailand, has learned the island's language and spent a year living in the village, adopting its customs and proving his commitment. The wedding ceremony blends elements from both cultures, creating something new that honors both traditions. In year 12, the first child born to a couple, where one partner is from outside the island, takes their first steps in the village square. The child is being raised bilingual in the island's language and their other parents' language, a living symbol of the bridge being built between the island and the wider world. The elders bless the child in the traditional way, welcoming them as a full member of the community despite their mixed heritage. By year 15 after first contact, the island has become a model for managed cultural transition. The United Nations points to it as a success story, evidence that Indigenous communities can maintain their distinctiveness while engaging with modernity. Researchers from around the world visit the research station on the neighbouring island, studying not just the traditional culture, but the process of change itself, trying to understand what factors allowed the islanders to navigate contact so successfully when so many other isolated populations were devastated by it. You know the answers and have written about them extensively. The island's success comes from multiple factors. The long period of stable isolation that allowed for strong cultural development, the sophisticated decision-making structures that enabled collective rather than individual choices about change, the gradual nature of contact that gave them time to adapt, the respect shown by outsiders who prioritized the islanders' agency, and perhaps most importantly, the wisdom of the elders who understood that preservation doesn't mean stasis, and that living cultures must change or die. On your 40th visit, in year 14 after first contact, you realize that you've been visiting the island for longer than you've worked at any job, lived in any city, or maintained any relationship in your adult life. The island has become your constant, the fixed point around which your life revolves. You know its people better than you know your own colleagues. You speak its language well enough to dream in it. You've documented its transformation from isolation to integration with a thoroughness that no other culture change has ever been recorded with. Kaimana, now in his early 40s, has grey in his hair and children of his own. One of his daughters is planning to study medicine on the outside, with the goal of returning to establish a small clinic on the island that combines traditional healing practices with modern medicine. His son is more interested in staying, learning the craft of making traditional boats, and preserving skills that were nearly lost during the period when the island didn't need to travel by sea. You should write another book, Kaimana tells you one evening, as you sit on the beach watching the sunset, about what we have become, not just what we were. Too many people still think of us as the isolated island, frozen in time. They don't know that we have changed, that we are different now, but still ourselves. He's right. The story needs updating. It needs to include the 15 years of change, adaptation, and evolution. The island that time passed by has rejoined the flow of time, but it hasn't been swept away. It rides the current deliberately, choosing its course, maintaining its integrity while adapting to new conditions. You write the second book over the next 2 years, visiting the island every 3 months and spending the intervening periods analysing your notes, reviewing your recordings, and synthesizing 15 years of quarterly visits into a coherent narrative. This book is titled The Island in Time, 15 Years of Continuity and Change, and it picks up where the first book ended, following the islanders through a decade and a half of selective modernization. The new book details the specific choices the islanders made, which technologies to adopt and which to reject, which traditions to maintain rigorously and which to let evolve, how to balance individual freedom with community cohesion, and how to engage with the outside world while maintaining their distinctiveness. It's a more complex story than the first book, less dramatic, but perhaps more useful as a roadmap for other communities navigating similar transitions. Change is inevitable, you write in this book's conclusion. The question is never whether a culture will change, but how it will change and who controls that change. The islanders understood this from the beginning. They didn't resist change, they managed it. They didn't cling blindly to tradition. They evaluated each element of their culture and made conscious decisions about what to preserve and what to let evolve. They didn't reject modernity wholesale. They selectively adopted elements that aligned with their values and served their needs. The result is a culture that is both ancient and modern, both traditional and innovative, and both isolated and connected. They are not what they were 15 years ago, but they are still themselves, recognizably and authentically, the people whose ancestors chose isolation 8,000 years ago, and who chose engagement 15 years ago. The second book is published in year 17 after first contact. It generates less media attention than the first, because the island is no longer news, no longer the sensational story of discovery, but it has more impact in academic and policy circles, becoming required reading in anthropology and Indigenous studies programs and cited in policy documents about cultural preservation and Indigenous rights. You're invited to speak at the United Nations to present the island's story as a case study in successful cultural transition. Standing before the assembled representatives of the world's nations, you tell the story of 8,000 years of isolation, ending not in destruction but in transformation, of a people who chose to engage with modernity on their own terms and succeeded in maintaining their cultural integrity while doing so. The lesson, you tell the assembly, is not that isolation is good or that integration is good. The lesson is that agency is good. Communities that control their own destinies and that make their own choices about their own futures can navigate change successfully. Communities that have change imposed on them, whether that change is forced isolation or forced integration, suffer. The island's success is not about the specific choices they made, but about the fact that they were able to make choices at all. The speech is well received, but you wonder how much will actually change in policy and practice. The world is still full of isolated and Indigenous communities facing pressures from development, resource extraction, climate change, and cultural imperialism. Most of them don't have the luxury the island had, the 15-month gap between discovery and contact, the careful protocols, and the respect for agency. Most face rapid, chaotic, destructive contact that gives them no opportunity to adapt gradually. But perhaps the island's story can be a template, a demonstration that another way is possible. Perhaps future contact situations can be managed more carefully, with more respect for Indigenous agency and more patience in allowing communities to adapt at their own pace. It's a small hope, but it's something. You continue visiting the island quarterly, watching it evolve year by year. By year 20 after first contact, the transformation is remarkable, yet subtle. The village has grown slightly, with new structures added to accommodate a slow population increase, as modern medicine reduced infant mortality and increased lifespan. Solar power is ubiquitous, providing electricity for lighting, communication, and refrigeration. A small school building has been constructed where children learn both traditional knowledge from the elders and academic subjects from teachers who rotate in from outside. But the fundamental patterns of life remain unchanged. People still wake with the sun and sleep shortly after dark. The communal cooking area is still the social heart of the village. The archive structure is still carefully maintained. Its bark cloth records now supplemented with digital backups, but not replaced. The language is still the primary medium of communication, with English and other languages used only when necessary for outside interaction. The 3 young people who left 20 years ago to study have all returned, bringing their knowledge back to the island. The biologist has helped establish a sustainable aquaculture program that supplements the traditional fishing. The anthropologist has created a comprehensive ethnographic record of their own culture, an insider's perspective on the island's history and practices. The engineer has designed improved water collection and distribution systems that work with traditional materials and methods rather than requiring outside technology to maintain. Their children, the first generation born after the opening to the outside world, are growing up with a foot in both worlds. They speak the island's language and English fluently, understand both traditional navigation and GPS, and can weave a basket and code a computer program. They're not torn between cultures, but enriched by both, able to draw on multiple knowledge systems as they navigate their lives. In year 22, you attend the dedication of a new addition to the archive structure, a wing specifically designed to house digital records and equipment. The irony is not lost on you. A culture that maintained its history on bark cloth for 8,000 years now backs up those records on hard drives and cloud servers. But the bark cloth production continues. The traditional archivists still carefully recording significant events and decisions in the old way, ensuring that the practice doesn't die even as it's supplemented with new technologies. Kaimana's daughter, now a doctor who splits her time between a hospital in Auckland and the island's small clinic, gives a speech at the dedication. She talks about the importance of preserving knowledge in multiple forms, the value of redundancy in record keeping, and the wisdom of not depending entirely on any single technology or medium. Our ancestors understood that bark cloth could last for centuries if properly maintained, she says. But they also would understand that digital storage has its own advantages. We honor them by using both, by being as thoughtful about our record keeping as they were about theirs. The speech is given in the island's language, with Kaimana translating into English for the handful of outsiders present. His translation is smooth and natural, the result of 2 decades serving as the primary bridge between the island and the outside world. He's in his mid-40s now, still energetic, but carrying the weight of his role with increasing gravity. He's training his younger brother to take over some of his responsibilities, ensuring that the work of translation and mediation will continue into the next generation. That evening, you sit with several of the elders, including a woman in her 60s who was a young adult during your first visit. She speaks English well enough to converse directly, though she prefers her own language when possible. "Do you think we made the right choice?" she asks you. Opening to the outside world, sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed isolated, if we gave up something precious that we can never get back. It's a question you've thought about often, and your answer has evolved over the years. I think you made the only choice you could make, you say carefully. Once we found you, once the world knew you existed, isolation was no longer sustainable. The question wasn't whether to engage, but how. And I think the way you've done it, the deliberateness and care and respect for your own culture, that's the right way. You haven't lost yourselves in the outside world. You've expanded yourselves to include it. She considers this, then nods slowly. That is what the old man used to say. Before he died, he told us that we were not becoming less ourselves, but more ourselves. We were adding to our culture, not replacing it. I think he was right, but I also think it's harder than he made it sound. Every choice to adopt something new is also a choice not to keep something old exactly as it was. We're constantly balancing, constantly deciding what to preserve and what to let go. That's the nature of culture, you say. All cultures are constantly making those choices, whether they acknowledge it or not. The difference is that you're making them consciously, collectively, and deliberately. Most cultures drift through change, responding to pressures without really choosing their direction. You're choosing. The conversation continues late into the night, ranging across topics from cultural identity to generational change to the future of the island. The woman's concerns are legitimate and important, but they're also the concerns of a living culture actively engaging with its own evolution. A dead culture doesn't worry about change because it's no longer capable of changing. The island's culture is vibrantly, messily, and sometimes uncomfortably alive. As you approach the 25th anniversary of first contact, you begin to think about closure, about ending your own role in the island's story. You're in your early 60s now, and the quarterly trips are becoming more physically demanding. More importantly, the island has reached a kind of equilibrium, a stable state of selective integration that doesn't require constant monitoring or documentation. The urgent phase of managing first contact is long over. The island's people have developed their own systems and structures for engaging with the outside world. Your role has become more symbolic than substantive, more about maintaining relationships than gathering data. You discuss this with Kaimana on your 90th visit, approaching what will be your 100th quarterly trip to the island. I think it's time for me to step back, you tell him. Not to stop visiting entirely, but to stop being the primary researcher and documenter. The story has moved beyond the initial contact phase. It's become your story to tell, not mine. Kaimana understands immediately. Yes, he says, we have our own people now who can do this work. My daughter, the anthropologist, the young man studying documentary filmmaking, and others who can tell our story from inside rather than having it told from outside. We are grateful for what you have done, for how you have told our story with respect and honesty. But you are right that it is time for the voice to shift. The 100th visit, in year 25 after first contact, is marked with ceremony. The entire island gathers to honor your 25 years of quarterly visits, to thank you for your role in documenting their history and advocating for their rights. They give you a special bark cloth, created specifically for this occasion, that tells the story of the contact period from their perspective. It's a precious gift, a piece of their history entrusted to you. Kaimana's daughter, the anthropologist, makes a presentation about the new Indigenous research collective she and others are forming. They'll take over the documentation work, recording their culture's ongoing evolution from an insider perspective. They'll control how their story is told, what information is shared with the outside world, and what remains private within the community. We learned from watching you, she tells you, how to observe carefully, how to record accurately, and how to analyze without losing sight of the human reality behind the data. But we also learned that our story is ours to tell. We're taking that responsibility now, with gratitude for how you have carried it until we were ready. You make one final speech to the assembled community, trying to put 25 years of relationship into words. You talk about the privilege of witnessing their transformation, the honor of being trusted with their story, and the hope you have for their future. You thank them for their patience with your questions, their generosity in sharing their knowledge, and their wisdom in navigating the challenges of contact and change. You have shown the world, you say, that isolation and integration are not the only options, that there are paths between them, ways of maintaining cultural distinctiveness while engaging with global civilization. You have demonstrated that Indigenous peoples are not artifacts to be preserved or obstacles to be overcome, but living communities capable of making sophisticated choices about their own futures. You have given me not just a career, but a life's purpose, and I am more grateful for that than I can express. The ceremony ends with traditional dancing and feasting, a celebration lasting late into the night. It's not a goodbye, not entirely, because you'll still visit occasionally and still maintain relationships with the people who have become like family over 25 years. But it is a transition, a passing of responsibility from outside documenters to inside storytellers, from your generation to theirs. As you board the boat the next morning for the last time as the island's primary researcher, you look back at the beach one final time. The village is as beautiful as it was on your first visit 25 years ago, but it's also fundamentally different. Solar panels glint in the sun beside traditional structures. Children wave from the beach, calling out in both their language and English. Smoke rises from cooking fires that heat food stored in solar-powered refrigerators. The island has changed, is changing, and will continue to change, but it remains itself, recognizably and authentically the culture that chose isolation 8,000 years ago and chose engagement 25 years ago. The island that time passed by has rejoined time, but on its own terms, at its own pace, following its own path. That, you think, as the boat carries you away, is the real story. Not that they remained unchanged for 8 millennia, but that when change came, they shaped it rather than being shaped by it. They were never lost, never discovered, never frozen in time. They were always making choices, always evolving, always human in the fullest sense of that word. And that story, the story of agency and choice and cultural resilience, is a story that matters, the story that will endure long after you and all the outsiders who witnessed the contact period are gone. The island's people will tell it to their children, who will tell it to theirs, carrying forward the knowledge of how their ancestors navigated one of history's great transitions with wisdom and grace and determined sovereignty over their own destiny. The island that time passed by has become the island in time, flowing with history's current but not swept away by it, changed but not destroyed, modern and ancient simultaneously, a living demonstration that culture is not a fixed thing to be preserved, but a dynamic process to be lived. And that lesson, more than any specific data point or linguistic analysis or genetic finding, is what you carry with you as you depart. The knowledge that human cultures are resilient and adaptable and capable of extraordinary things when given the agency to choose their own paths forward.